The title of my paper is indeed Reconstructing the Life of Anna Vieira dos Santos, circa 1895 to 1933. But in some ways, this is misleading. The fact is, my goal in reconstructing the life of this Black Brazilian woman is actually to get to my subtitle, which is Notes on Ethnography as Atlantic History. It's my contention that the process of reconstructing Anna's life, we'll say Anna for the sake of English language, but Anna, right? Reconstructing her life offers us a lucid case study to rethink how ethnography can be a means of doing Atlantic history. In other words, how this very local and specific way of doing research allows us to address the huge geographic and temporal frame of the Atlantic world. Let's turn, before we get to all of the sort of details of her life, let's turn first to the idea of ethnography. What am I talking about? So the guiding question here is, how can we use ethnography to do Atlantic history? The term itself, ethnography, is problematic, and it's used far more broadly than its etymology suggests. In fact, etymologically speaking, ethnography means simply writing about, the graphy, right? Writing about people, ethno. But it's not that simple. It's never that simple. Because ethnography has come to rely so heavily on fieldwork, it has become almost synonymous with fieldwork. Ethnography has thus come to mean going to a place where real people live and learning from them through conversations, experiences, and observations. Thus, anything that might include fieldwork, such as interviews, films, audio recordings, are often unproblematically called ethnographic. Ethnographic interviews, ethnographic films, ethnographic audio recordings. But still, what is ethnography, if not just writing about people? And you can all check the books, folks. There are lots and lots of definitions, but they all tend to suggest the same thing. According to the last century of anthropologists, ethnographic fieldwork allows us to learn how someone or some people live and see the world, whether described as the native's point of view, as we see in Malinowski. I'm not going to read the quotes. You can look at them as I talk or not, but what's in red is what I'm going to read. A stratified hierarchy of meaningful structures. That's what ethnography is supposed to give us, according to Gertz. Or, as Ortner more recently puts it, an attempt to understand another life world. But all of these occlude an important assumption about ethnography. And it appears to be because it's so self-evident, which is that ethnography is for learning about the present, or more precisely, what we problematically like to call the ethnographic present. That is, the period during which the ethnographer conducted their ethnographic fieldwork. Ethnographies, in other words, are almost definitionally not histories. In the field of ethnomusicology, for instance, we often see the ethnographic placed in opposition to the historical. To take one recent example, Harris Berger and Ruth Stone tell us quite matter-of-factly that their 2019 collection, Theory for Ethnomusicology, presents, quote, a range of ethnographic and historical case studies. An ethnographic case study is therefore opposed to the historical. This may seem unremarkable as I'm reading it. After all, I know that on more than one grant application, I have written something like, I will use ethnographic and historical methodologies. But there's a lot to unpack, or there's a lot packed in, rather, in this sort of banal phrase. At the very least, it tells us that the ethnographic would not ever be necessarily historical. But how crazy, right? The ethnographic doesn't say anything about what historical tells us. The ethnographic designates a method, a product, a spirit even, while historical is little more than a temporal orientation. But we all know the implied meanings and understandings. The ethnographic is presumed to refer to an oral and ephemeral present, while the historical would refer to a permanent past that exists primarily in archivable forms of documentation or material culture. But this is what I would like to question today. I want to argue that this has incorrectly been conceptualized as an oppositional relationship and thus blinded us to how historical ethnographic fieldwork can be. What if doing ethnography meant doing history? What if we reimagined going to the field as something akin to going to the archive, where we'd learn history? But of course, this isn't anything new. As many ethnomusicologists, and forgive me for focusing on ethnomusicology, it's the field I was trained to think is real. As many ethnomusicologists have shown us, we can use fieldwork to gather life histories, myths, collective memories, and the types of historical remembering that Philip Bowman calls ethnomusicologies pasts. But these approaches tend not to fit into what historians call empirical history. What I mean is that because myths and collective memories are mediated by the politics of the present, they give us types of historical knowledge that are mutable, shifting, and impermanent. My interest in the historicity of ethnographic fieldwork, however, is in finding the empirical history that Western historians have built their discipline on. I'm interested in what philosophers call B-series time, or what Michel Rolph-Trouillot called the materiality of socio-historical processes. In other words, how can ethnography help us tap into the supposedly objective sequential history of events that professional historians generally study? This would make a recounted story or a sung song a datum that is as objectively historical as a census record, a newspaper report, or a death certificate. The impermanence of the present is, however, a problem for most historians. But if we reorient what it is that we garner from what we see, hear, smell, and feel in the present, then I think we can start collapsing the specious divide between the ethnographic and the historical. In fact, I think that forgetting how very historical ethnography can be is a lost opportunity for historians as well as ethnographers, who, both historians and ethnographers, I'm suggesting, might very well be the same people. To make my case, I want to focus on what may seem to be the least intuitive use of ethnography for historical research, Atlantic history. And I say it's least intuitive because it's a field of history focused on the world born out of the circum-Atlantic circulation of goods over this enormous geographic space, right? Starting in the 15th century. So we're dealing with like 500 years and all of this space and geopolitical terrain. So how can ethnographic fieldwork, which is so localized and so personal, attend to the expansive geographical, temporal, and conceptual territory of the Atlantic world? Perhaps the best starting point comes from a particular approach to Atlantic history known as Atlantic biography. This is doing Atlantic history by way of individuals, especially Africans and their descendants, who have been ignored and marginalized in historical accounts and narratives. In the epilogue to his remarkable 19th century biography of the African Candomblé priest Domingos Sodré, historian João José Reis explains why the biographical approach to Atlantic history is so valuable. Biographies of Africans and their descendants enable us to perceive the broad movement of history from a new, more human perspective, including the slave trade, the rise and fall of slavery in the New World, the reshaping of the Old World by colonization and slave labor. In short, the formation of Atlantic societies, economies, and cultures. There is a keen interest in biographies of this kind in Brazil as well. I am not referring to the biographies of major figures such as Black abolitionists, but of people who live in the shadows of anonymity, whose memory has either been lost or belongs more to the realm of myth than history. And while Hayes is right about the biographical approach, here's that silly dichotomy again, this time from a historian. It's that binary opposition of history to ethnography, here designated as history and myth. History is written. It's a permanent, archivable past that has infinitely more historical weight and is more objectively real than the ephemeral present of ethnography, where we would find our myths. History here alludes to that which is written, that which fits Western modernity's understanding of verifiable fact. After all, Hayes is suggesting that by writing about Domingos Sodré, for example, he is also placing the African priest into history, making him a historical figure. But there's also a methodological implication that becomes particularly evident when looking at the range of Hayes's, for some reason it sounds funny to say plural, and when I'm saying it on paper it looks fine. when looking at the range of his primary sources: civil records, police reports, archived letters, and so forth. In other words, it's by turning to history rather than to myth that Hayes is able to write Sodré into history. With this, we have a lucid example of what Diana Taylor highlights as the Western tendency to privilege the archive over the repertoire for historical knowledge, the archivable over the performed. But what of other performed history? The kind of a history found in oral narratives and performances, and the very myths dismissed by Hayes. In other words, what about the kinds of history we find through ethnography? What would happen if we were to recast this dichotomy, not as a binary opposition, but instead as two complementary epistemologies, two kinds of knowledge, both equally historical, but in significantly different ways? Might not this difference, when applied to the life histories of Atlantic people, actually allow us to construct even more robust biographies and an even deeper understanding of the complexities of the Atlantic world and the people who populated it, and it continued to populate it? The story of Anna Vieira dos Santos suggests it would indeed. Anna Vieira dos Santos was a Black woman who lived her short turn of the 20th century life in Cachoeira, in the interior of Bahia, Brazil, from whence I speak to you. Not Cachoeira, but Bahia. With this story, I hope to show precisely how ethnographic data can in fact be used to do history in a way that complements, supplements, and even corrects the history we find in the archives. Like the subjects in Atlantic biography, Anna was a historical nobody. She wasn't famous, she wasn't powerful, she wasn't wealthy. Her historical footprint is about as light as they come. To this day, I have found very few documents related to her or her family's lives. I find marriage certificates, death certificates, birth certificates, and that's about it. But the scant documentation does allow us to construct a story. It's a story that pales in comparison to what we get through myth, song, and oral stories. But nevertheless, let's see what kind of story the documents allow us to construct. Here's a couple of pictures of Cachoeira in 1930. And we start our story at Anna's death. Christmas 1933, in the once bustling riverside villa of Cachoeira, was anything but joyful for Anna's husband, Firmino, and their daughters, Emilia and Maria de Lourdes. After all, less than a week earlier, Anna's life was tragically cut short by what was described on her death certificate as a fever. She was not yet 40. Then, just barely 4 months later, Emilia and Maria de Lourdes lost their father, Anna's widower, right? Firmino, who died of tuberculosis. With Anna's death, of course, her paper trail ends. But we have enough information to begin filling in a bit more about her past. We can look at the records of her daughters, and we can learn about their careers in the transnational cigar industry. Or we can go the other direction and see that she was the legitimate daughter of Maria Porciana dos Passos and João Francisco dos Santos. Like her daughter, Maria was a Black woman born in Cachoeira in 1853. Well, not like her daughter, but she was born in Cachoeira. But she was born in 1853. It's unclear whether or not Maria was born into slavery. But by the time Anna's only known brother, Pedro, was a year old in 1888, slavery would have already been abolished in Brazil. Less is known about Anna's father, João Francisco dos Santos. All I know is that both were intimately linked to one of the city's most important confraternities, the Brotherhood of the Good Patient Lord Jesus, Irmandade do Senhor Bom Jesus da Paciência. For João and Maria, this meant participating actively in the annual April procession for their patron saint, the Good Patient Lord Jesus. Indeed, the procession would have been accompanied by one of the many local philharmonic bands, which are informal, sort of amateur brass bands, whose repertoire comprised primarily marches and dobrados, sort of paso dobles. The story the documents allow us to construct is not uninteresting. And if we had more time, we might delve into some of the Atlantic processes these data bring to life. We might look, for instance, at how important lay Catholic brotherhoods and philharmonic bands were for Black sociality during the 19th century. Or we might look at the cigar industry, in which Anna's daughters worked, and which was one of the most important forms of employment for Black women in the early 20th century. All of this would serve as fruitful directions for telling the Atlantic histories in which Anna and her family were entangled. Nevertheless, I'd like to shift gears to a different kind of historical knowledge, that which we get in the rituals, songs, and stories brought to life by Anna's descendants. One of the first things we learn when talking to Anna's descendants is that she largely defined herself by way of her devotion to Saint Roch, a French saint of pestilence, medieval French saint, for whom Anna held a sung prayer ceremony every year on August 16th, his official feast day. It's through reenacting Anna's mythical party that her descendants place Anna back into history, pulling her out of the shadows of anonymity, to use João Reis's phrase. By mythical, I mean it is an extraordinary story that is known and believed to have happened. What Iliad, or Eliad, tells us is from in the beginning. And this is precisely how Anna's descendants, none of whom ever met her, understand their ancestors' prayer ceremony. It's a myth. They reenact the Saint Roch party on August 16th because that's how Anna did it. They hold it in Anna's home on the slide here on the left because that's how Anna did it. They use the same centenarian statuette of Saint Roch that Anna passed down to them because it was her statuette. And they insist on the same ritual sequence that Anna used. Songs for the West African Orisha, Obaluaye, early in the morning, and then right after that, they head down to morning mass before they invite the whole congregation up to their home for breakfast, up to that precise home, right? Anna's house. Then at night is the cycle of Catholic hymns and samba dancing. All of this is because it's what Anna did. Their annual saint party, which reenacts their ancestors' mythical party, offers us a kind of historical knowledge only graspable through ethnographic fieldwork. But the music, the decorations, the prayers, they're different every year. So how can this myth be historical knowledge if it's always different? Change, in fact, is built into the structure of the party. They are built into what Diana Taylor calls a scenario, which, as she puts it, lays out the range of possibilities for predictable actions and behaviors while also being flexible and open to change. As such, we get historical knowledge that is related not to specific archivable data, but rather to broad structural logics, cosmological truths, and devotional strategies, as well as knowledge about who Anna was and what mattered to her. But the fact is, the ritual reenactment of Anna's mythical saint party for Saint Roch is actually a complex and vibrant form of historical knowledge that intertwines our archive, performance, and biology. After all, we have a house and a statuette, that is to say material culture, or material history, forgive me, which are given meaning and context through the date of the party, the 16th of August, and the ritual sequence. While all of this is always grounded in the truth of the family's own genetic link to the past. It truly is what Taylor calls a DNA of performance. Still, we seem to be distant from Atlantic history. So how can ethnography help us find the kind of empirical history that historians depend on? We can go in two directions, both of which are built on a dynamic dialogue between the archive and the repertoire. First, we can use written documentation to tease out the details of what the mythical narrative suggests. For instance, the written documentation suggests that the cycle of Catholic prayers that were sung at Anna's home would, like the singing today, have been sung in an a cappella way and mixing Latin and Portuguese, a funny Latin, as the newspaper sort of intimates. That's not the exact language. I forgot what the language is. Furthermore, accounts from the era suggest that the samba in the 1930s looked a lot like it does today. The same types of guitars and the same types of drums, the same call and response singing, the same belly bounce in the middle of a ring of participants who are clapping a rhythm. In other words, we can use the documents to get more detail on the structural elements that lack the specificities to truly understand how Anna's party played out. At the same time, however, we can use the collective memory to tease out the details missing from the documents. For instance, we learned that Catholicism was not Anna's only religious world, and in fact, it's her involvement with other spiritual entities that are responsible for her fatal fever in 1933. Anna, it turns out, was a medium for the Orisha Obaluwaye, and she would sometimes receive the deity unexpectedly. On these occasions, Anna's youngest daughter, Maria de Lourdes, would have to walk her mother's trembling body to Aganjujide, which was a famous candomblé house quite distant from her home. On this note, we should remember that Anna's death certificate indicates that she died of a fever, while her husband, Firmino, was said to die of tuberculosis. But anyone in the family will tell you that this is only half of the story, and it's the least important part. The whole story of the deaths of Anna and Firmino is far more interesting, far more didactic, and far more Atlantic. The story goes something like this. Once upon a time, Anna and Firmino, vovó and vovó, right? Grandpa and grandma, lived in Cachoeira with their two daughters. When was this? It doesn't matter. It was in the beginning, before our time. One night, it doesn't matter what the date was, Firmino learned there was going to be a candomblé party up at Aganjujide, the candomblé house. Anna's husband decided he was not going to let his wife go up to the candomblé house again. It was enough. He'd had it. So Firmino stood at Anna's feet. He stood there and refused to let her go up to the house of worship. Right then, Obaluwaye, the same Obaluwaye to whom they sing songs at the beginning of St. Masses or St. Roch's Mass, right? Home Mass. Right then, Obaluwaye grabbed her, and the African god threw his medium's body back and forth. But Firmino stood his ground. He didn't budge. He wouldn't let Anna go. So Obaluwaye spoke. I have a response for you. Shortly thereafter, she was dead, leaving her two daughters without their loving mother. But the response, Obaluwaye's prophetic warning, wasn't just for Anna. It was for Anna's widower too. Firmino too would soon lose his life, a death caused by alcoholism after having turned to the bottle in order to numb the unshakable remorse he felt for having played such a lead role in his wife's death. We can now start to understand just how Atlantic Anna's spiritual world was. She was a Black woman whose parents, who may or may not have been enslaved, were deeply involved in a lay brotherhood, celebrating their patron saints to the sound of local philharmonic bands who played their own compositions written by Black composers. The annual parties Anna held comprised an eclectic mix of Latin and Portuguese prayers, Central African-derived samba dancing, and foodstuffs whose origins were found in Amerindian, African, and European traditions. All the while, she regularly served as a medium for a deity who arrived on Brazil's shores in the minds and bodies of enslaved Yoruba speakers. And it was this very African god who killed Anna, and by extension, her husband, setting off a chain of events that left her two pre-adolescent daughters to fend for themselves, become involved in the cigar industry, etc., etc. This narrative was only achievable, the one I just told you, the sort of summary narrative, by mixing myth with written archival documents, using ethnographic and archival sources, all of which tell a very robust and exciting history. Nothing is more historical than the other. It's all equally historical, but in different ways. A myth, a statuette, a death certificate, a song, a memory, all of it gives us different kinds of historical knowledge. So returning to my original question, how can we use ethnography to do Atlantic history? Ethnography may allow us the ability to construct more robust biographical sketches that offer an even more fascinating view of how Atlantic processes can and did play out in the past. Some historians might say my approach was only possible because Anna's story is merely a century old. This is partially true. But remember, no one I spoke with to do any of this research had ever met Anna or her husband, and yet the stories continue to be told to this day with excitement. We're at like the fourth generation here of grandkids for Anna, and they continue to tell the stories. Well, they're too young at this point, but they'll be told them. And there's no reason to think Anna's descendants are the only ones with such stories about long dead ancestors. In other words, history might mean searching for descendants rather than for ancestors. It's an important lesson for ethnographers and for historians who, I'm arguing, may very well be the same people. After all, doing history is not opposed to doing ethnography at all. But in order to do history through ethnography, we might need to reconceptualize what the purpose of ethnography is in the first place. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. Questions?
Zoom kept telling me my internet was unstable. I hope nothing got too cut off.
No, I think Michael has a question.
Michael, thank you so much for a really beautiful story, and I was really amazed by the way you put all the information together. I just have like a very small technical question. I'm curious to hear your thoughts about what you think. I think what you're calling myth, I would call oral history, because oral history I don't necessarily think of the pursuit of. Oh, you need to go closer. Yeah, my question is about your thoughts on the difference between myth versus oral history.
Sorry, and forgive me, the question got a little tiny bit cut off, but I heard the question, I think. The difference between oral history and myth. I guess myth is the broader category of isolatable thing, by which I mean you can tell a myth through oral history, but you can also act out a myth, right? So meaning, Thanksgiving dinner, no one is necessarily, yes, we do tell the myth to make it make sense, but we act it out as well. And what I would argue in this particular case, I think a lot of it is categorizable as oral history, but it's all tied to this mythical understanding of a beginning, right? So is a biblical tale, it's written down, of course, right? We would call that a myth. It could be told as well. It's I see me again.
Thank you, that's really helpful.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I don't know that I've finished. I don't know that there's a clear distinction, I guess, is my point. It depends on what the oral history is about, I guess.
Thank you. Any more questions? Oh, that's fine.
No, I raised my hand after you.
Oh,
turned
okay.
your back. Hi, Michael. I don't know. Should I move? Julia here. Amazing presentation. I really like the reclaiming of ethnography and finding out that its constituent parts allow us to use the concept much more, well, actually more broadly, I suppose. My question is this, you have a very narrow scope for what you presented today, within the confines of one individual in one house, the lived experience of one, can you not hear me? Okay. Hi there, can you hear me now?
Sorry, the question always turns, now I can't. Yeah, it's always right when we get to the question that suddenly everything breaks up.
Okay.
Sorry.
Sounds good. I thank you for your paper. I really liked your reformulation of ethnography. And what is nice about it is you made it not claim anything more than the actual etymology gives us, right? What is it if it just means writing about people? So that's a very limited scope that you are claiming for that word, which is quite nice because it lets you do some interesting things. And the story that you told us also was quite constrained in terms of what you presented. It was in the confines of the house that you showed us, of the individuals that you spoke about. I was entirely convinced of its importance for, let's say, even a whole chapter. Well, there's no reason why our knowledge can't live in constrained small ways. But my question is, are you tempted to broaden this way in to extrapolate and make larger claims about communities or cities or groups of people or genres or whatever. Does this, are there any considerations you need to take into account if you scope out, or do you think it's necessary to retain that small scope in order to really do what you want to do with this?
I think I understood the question, and it's a fascinating one. But just let me reiterate, just in case I got it wrong. But it's the sort of the necessarily small scope, right? Is it part of how this is done? I think that's sort of, I'm going to interpret it sort of that way. Is that roughly what we're talking about here? That question?
Yeah.
Yes. Did I freeze? Okay, I'm sorry. We have internet issues this week. Anywho, so basically, and correct, stop me if it starts to get frozen here. I didn't start with a specific story. This is research that started on the macro level. This is research that started out at everyone's houses. I mean, I would just knock on houses like an insane person and say, "Can I be at your party?" And they would either let me in or not. And this is, and I came to find out that every single house has their own story about how their devotion came to be. And this is a particularly illustrative one because of the all of the stories in some ways tease out these sort of, or you can tease out these Atlantic stories from all of them. But this is the clearest one. So I sort of focused on it. And because the descendants are particularly interested in telling the story, not everyone is, that I focused on them. But in fact, the historical work I've done to sort of recreate it, looking at written documents, it's all this sort of giant, these are social, this is common, right? Meaning it's a birthday party, if you will, for a saint. Everyone does it, except not everyone does it in the same way, and everyone does it differently. So I just said everyone does it, not everyone does it, because it's like a birthday party, right? It's so super normal, but also you don't have to do it either, right? You could just live your life. But it's a super common practice, widespread socially since at least the late 19th century, if not way earlier. Right? The point being that the way to really make the story interesting, I think, for me, is to focus on the individuals, is to focus on the small scale, because it allows me to bring these people to life. I feel like I can get to know them. It seems to me like that's the glory, that's the thing I really love about Atlantic biography as an approach, is because you attach to this person that you kind of care about in order to understand, or, hopefully the narrator convinces you, and historians are wonderful narrators typically. They convince you that their things actually make sense, right? That you get these large stories, but they're built on a person that gives you something to hold on to. So I think for the story aspect, we do need a small scale. But for actually understanding it in context, in both historical and sort of contemporary for each era context, I think you do need the other larger scale. So I think they both, just like the archive, it seems to me, and the repertoire, to use the keep with our Diana Taylor, it seems to me that they work together, right? The larger has to be in dialogue with the very, very local, for it to be a story that's worth telling, it seems to me.
I think we should probably.
I hope that answers the question, Julia. I think it's Julia, right? I couldn't even tell. I assume.
Yep. Thank you again, Michael.